and we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to the HathiTrust Community Week and to the third and last session of day one, titled Mining the Native American Authored Works in HathiTrust for Insights. I'm Graham Detmers, the metadata analyst at HathiTrust. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm going to do what we all came here for, go over a little housekeeping. First, or if you could go ahead and change slides. So first, we want to take a minute to remind everyone that HathiTrust events adhere to our HathiTrust Code of Conduct, which can be found on our website and will be posted into the chat shortly. Next slide. Be sure to keep your cameras off and your microphone muted for today's presentation. Please type any questions you have into the chat at any time. My colleague, Jessica Rohr, will be keeping track of them, and then I'll read them when we reach the end of the presentation and it's time for Q&A. Closed captioning is available for this presentation, and a link to the slides is available in chat. This session is being recorded, as you should have already seen, and we plan to post this session on our YouTube channel, and then we'll also email you a link to the recording and the slides after the presentation. If you find yourself having any technical issues, you can send a DM to Jessica and they'll assist you. Next slide. Oh, I already did this one. So next slide. So also, please, if you're on Twitter or any other social media, tweet about Community Week using this hashtag. And then don't forget to play the HathiTrust bingo. So now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Toon Liu, an associate professor at the Information School at the University of Oklahoma, to start the session.
Thank you, Greg. Thanks for the introduction and for setting up the stage. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our session. My name is Quinn. I'm an associate professor at the School of Library and Information Studies at OU. Along with me today, there are two of my colleagues, Raina Heaton and Raymond Orr. They are from the Department of Native American Studies. And today, it's my pleasure to share with you our project on mining the Native American authored works for insights, which is sponsored by the HTRC through the SCWAReD project funded by Mellon Foundation. And the project overview today, I'm going to cover the goals of our project, the research questions that drives our project, the method we used, and we're going to share some result on the Native American authors and works we have collected, the Native authored workset we created, which is also in the HTRC Analytics website. It's an open workset people can access. And we're going to talk about some results from the term frequency analysis, topic modeling results, and I'm going to show some demo of our word embedding application. A caution is we are still actually in the middle of the data analysis. We have collected lots of data and haven't gone through all of the data yet, but we are really excited to share some initial findings with the audience today. So this project is somehow inspired actually by another project of similar kind in the University of Kansas, where they have a history of Black writing project, like collect Black authors and their works. I thought about the Native authors and works because the Native community is also a historically under-resourced textual community, and we want to find some ways of analyze their works and the way they're writing and the kind of topics they wrote, which we didn't find any very well-organized collection in the first place. So the goals of our project is to identify the Native American authors and their works. And then want to search those authors and works in HathiTrust Digital Library to see how much of them are covered in HathiTrust Digital Library. As we know, HathiTrust is a very big digital library, has more than 70 million volumes. I want to see if there's any gaps in covering this historically under-resourced textual community and their works. On top of that, once we are able to create a workset in HathiTrust, we're able to access the HathiTrust full text, and a lot of tools come with it to apply text mining on the workset we created to understand what's in those works. And we also want to compare the works generated by this particularly textual community with a baseline community that is of interest, where the native authors when they write on certain topics compare with non-native authors when they write similar topics, but by different set of authors. We also had a plan to, we actually have mentored students, assistants in native studies on in this digital humanity project. That's another goal of this project. So the research question we set out to address includes how is the coverage of the Native American author works in HathiTrust? And then the second one we are interested in answering are what are the characteristics of the writing styles of these native authors? How do they compare with non-native authors when they write on similar subjects during similar time period as well? And then we're interested to know what are the topics of this Native American author works in HathiTrust as revealed by topic modeling, which is a tool to analyze large scale of text and try to uncover the themes underlying it. In terms of method, we will first talk about the data collection part and then the text mining, because the data we collect is a foundation on which we can apply the text mining techniques to. We'll talk about the scope, the collection identification, how we search in HathiTrust digital library, and the gap analysis. In terms of text mining, today we're going to present result from term frequency analysis, and we also collect the keyword in context analysis. But we haven't really got a lot of time really into the context yet. We have the data, but we need to read more into the context. And we also will cover some initial findings from the topic modeling, and I'm going to share some demos of our word embedding result as well. So first of all, we need to set the scope of what we mean by the Native American authors, right? This is not a very precise science definition, scientific definition, but we try to operationalize it in a way where that's consistent for us to identify the authors. So we decided to include the authors from and publishing in the continental US and Canada. And the works are authored or co-authored by native people. So it means if there is at least one co-author is a native people, we include the work. And we also include works where native writers publish in a compilation or edited volumes. So that's a scope we decided to set to create our work set. And then it's challenging to go out find Native American authored works, right? We first find on the Internet Public Library, there's a collection of Native American authors collection, which they collected 631 Native authors and with 2017 work titles. So I wrote a script to parse, to scrape that data and store in a local database. And we later find out that collection was not quite updated because we found out the dates, the date range, it includes mostly until like 2009, right? Most of the latest work are not in. So we're still in the continuous process of adding newer works, but the Internet Public Library, the IPL dataset, is a foundation for us to start with the Native American authored works. And one of our collaborators, Raina Hinton, she's a curator of a Native American language collection, which is hosted at Sam Noble Museum at the University of Oklahoma. So she kindly screened the Native American languages collection and find out 122 titles that are authored by Native peoples. And she also contributed a list of dissertation titles by Native linguistics and students, which has 34 titles. So with these titles and authors, we collaborated with our HTRC collaborators, maybe Ryan and Isabella, they may be in the audience today. I can't see all the audience, but I really appreciate their assistance. The HTRC staff take the list of authors and titles we found and develop a tool to identify, to search the HathiTrust index and to identify the volumes in HathiTrust on these titles and authors based on the result based on the data we gave them, and they found the ones that are in the HathiTrust index, and we also, on top of that, we manually screen the results from the automatic searches to identify additional matches, because sometimes there are variations in author names. Sometimes there are variations in titles. With these, we are able to identify for the previously identifying the Native American collections, how many of them are actually covered in HathiTrust Digital Library. So this is a statistic based on what we found on the coverage of the Native American author works in HathiTrust. The IPL dataset has 2013 titles, out of which we found 900 in the HathiTrust Digital Library. It has a coverage of about 44%. And for the Native American language collection, it has 122 titles, out of which we found 37 covered actually in HathiTrust Digital Library, which has a 30% coverage. For the dissertations, we didn't find any of the titles covered in HathiTrust, so it has a coverage of 0. And we also had an interest to search a prominent journal in the field. It's titled American Indian Culture and Research Journal. This is a very famous and important journal in the field. It is covered by the HathiTrust Digital Library. So that's the coverage and gap analysis we found out. It's not great. It's like 30–40% of the works we have found are authored by Native American authors are in HathiTrust Digital Library. Consider the sheer volume that HathiTrust has. On the other hand, we also are continuing collecting a database locally on their Native American authors and their works. So we have student assistant continue adding more Native authors and works to our database, regardless if they're covered by their HathiTrust or not. So we have our own database of a list of Native authors and works. As of July 8th, 2022, our database has 837 Native authors and 2,350 works in the database. And another work we're trying to do is we're also trying to map the tribes to federally recognized tribe list because the original data set where we find these Native American authors and works, they use a variety of tribe names or sometimes ethnic groups. So we're trying to standardize this to a list of federally recognized tribes. After searching the list of Native American authors and their works in HathiTrust, we were able to create the native authored workset. So from their Internet Public Library workset, there are 900 titles that are covered in HathiTrust. Their date range is from 1826 to 2009. This data set has 358 native authors, and the null data set has 36 titles ranging from 1900 to 2006 with 15 native authors. We also find between these two workset, the IPL workset and null workset, there were some overlaps, meaning the same title that is covered by both workset. So when we merge these two worksets, we end up with 919 titles, which correspond to 1,083 number of Hathi records, and this many of Hathi items ranging from the date of 1826 to 2009 has a total of 369 native authors. So we use this merge workset as a native author workset. Right now, the native author workset is actually housed in HathiTrust Analytics. So if I click the link, should lead me to the workset page, where you actually it should be public, where you actually can see the list of native author workset there. So that's that. And it turns out actually out of the 919 titles, 13 are duplicate. So we actually end up with 906 unique HTIDs, which each of them correspond to uniquely one HathiTrust item. So with that native authored workset, we would like to understand how the native authors write in compared to some baseline, right? So we'll have something to compare against. To do that, we, with the assistance of the HTR staff again, we find a list of works by non-native authors in HathiTrust, but on similar subjects as our native authors. And during a similar time period with actually similar language representation. So we have a very special language specialist on our team who is really helping a lot in screening the language representation in the workset. So for the comparative workset, we end up with 981 volumes. It ranges from 1832 to 2009. You can see the time period is sort of controlled, matched with the native author workset. We also match the subjects of the two workset. So I want to see when native authors write on similar subjects as the non-native authors, do they have some similarity or differences in terms of the use of terms, in terms of the writing style, these kind of things that can be reviewed by the text mining. So in terms of text mining, the first thing, simplest thing to do is to look at the terms that is used in the works, right? And from the two domain experts on the team, Reina and Raymond, they contributed a list of terms that are of importance of interest to native studies. And the terms can be categorized into these 6 groups. The first group include the peoples and groups such as Vine, Delaware, Sitting Bull, Corner Parker, Custer, this kind of people name or people groups, and some special events and places such as Sand Creek, 12 Tears, Woody Knee, Black Hills, and some academic terms such as relationality, reciprocity, surveillance, decolonize, sovereignty, and some archaeology terms. It turns out we found some in our collection. There's some archaeology works as well, like prehistory, Mississippian artifacts, excavate. Some people terms like blood quantum, whites, savage, indigenous, and some miscellany terms such as land, massacre versus battle, frontier, new world. So we have this list of terms of interest that is to native studies. And the team takes this list of terms that is of interest to the domain. We develop a program to search the collections we have created, the work set we have created, right? So we have a native work set and we have a comparative work set that is written by the non-native. And the program search both work set to identify the occurrences of those keywords that is of interest here. So this list of keywords that is of interest, we search these keywords in their collection to identify, okay, so this keyword rights occurs in the work that has an idea of this and has a title of Walking the Road, which is published in 1993. And it has an occurrence, has a mention of the term on the page 6 in the 3rd sentence on that page. And this is the context is the sentence where the term occurs. I cannot show the entire sentence, but the term occurs in this sentence. And in addition to the sentence that has the term, we also collected the 5 sentences before and 5 sentences after the sentence that the term occurs. So with this program, we collected all the occurrences of the terms that are of interest to native studies in the native work set as well as in the comparative work set. And with this database, it's currently stored in the database. And with this database, we are actually able to write SQL queries to generate the term frequency data, such as for each of the keyword, how many times, how many works it occurs in certain year, and how many sentences it occurs. And it turns out we are interested in analyzing the number of works the term has occurred, so that we have a sense of how many works use these specific terms, right? And when comparing the native work set with the comparative work set, we're going to see if there is any differences in the term usage in terms of how many works mention the terms. However, there are different productivity in each of the time periods, such as year or decades, right? And by the way, on the left is the term frequency by the year. We collected this data, and on the right is the term frequency data by decade. decade. And first of all, we find out the term frequency data by the year has more variability. Well, the term frequency data by decade is probably more stable and consistent because and more robust to randomness by the year, right? And on top of that, we also notice in different decades, the number of works that are written by the authors are different, the productivity are different. So just purely looking at the raw number of works is not really giving us some accurate data. So we decided to do some normalization. So what we did in the normalization is we used the number of works that use the term divided by the total number of works in that time period. And in this table, I'm showing the time period in decades, such as the ab origin of this term in the 1830s. There's zero works mention this term or use this term, but in this time period, the 1830s, there are a total number of 2 works in the data collection in the native. It's actually the native work set in data collection. So the term usage is 0%, right? So if you look at, for example, their 1880 decade, out of the 2 works in the data collection we have in our work set, one of them use this term. So this is a 50% of the works that use these terms. So with this method, we normalize the decades, how many works mention the terms and how many works are published in that decade in total. We can get a percentage of the works that are published in that time period and also use the term. And we try to do this comparison between the native authors and non-native authors to see if their usage of the terms are any different. And on top of the term frequency analysis, we also run the topic modeling on our work set. We have a collection of text document in the native work set, and we have a collection of text document in the comparative work set. We pass these collections to the LDA topic modeling, which is a statistical unsupervised machine learning model to try to uncover the latent topics, the latent themes of the corpus by reading the statistics of the collection, such as the occurrences and co-occurrences of the terms. But the most important thing for us is this method, the LDA method, can help us to create the topics which can reveal the themes of the 2 work sets we have collected. And another thing we did is we use the word embedding method. We apply this on the native work set as well as the non-native work set, the comparative work set we collected. We run both models, but we finally decided to look into the skip-gram models more. But what this model does is it tries to learn a vector representation of each terms in the corpus, in the collection. And the vector representation of the term is supposed to be optimized based on their ability to predict their context, like their neighborly terms. These 2 models have slightly different objectives, but both of them are able to produce the vector representation of the terms, such as this is an example. This is not the terms in our collection, but But what the word embedding can give us, can provide us, is for each of the term in our collection, it represents the term as a vector, so that we are able to understand the relationship among the terms. What we will be able to do is we can give a term of interest to the model, and the model can tell us which are the most similar terms to the term that we gave the model, the term that is in query, so that we can see if the native authors from their works, the similar terms are same or different from that come from the comparative work set. So with that, I will briefly turn into my collaborator, Raina Hinton, to introduce some of the results we have found.
Thanks, Quinn. So yeah, as Quinn was saying, we are still very much in progress in terms of analyzing all of the data. But in terms of the general characteristics of the work sets in comparison to each other, and then also things like frequency and topics, we do have some preliminary stuff to share with you all. So just to point out some of the things so far that we found that's interesting. I think the first thing that sort of struck us as we were working on this project is just the fact that the vast majority of works about Native peoples are not written by Native people, right? I think all of us have this sense about the genre, but to have it actually quantified was, I mean, it was a little bit of a shock to me even. So if you think about, our 2,300-ish data set, when we searched to compile the native or the comparative non-native data set in HathiTrust, just the Indian Native American subject heading resulted in over 35,000 records, and which is not twice, not 3 times the volume of our data set, but 17 times more works about Native people who are not Native, or written by people who are not Native, when all of it is basically some form or other of Indigenous intellectual property. So I think that's a really important thing to point out about working with this textual community. Other thing is that the date range for Native authorship is pretty limited. There's a little bit prior to 1960, but of course, with the American Indian movement and everything in the 60s, and just access to things like publishing, Native authorship sort of exploded 1960s forward, and the representation before that is pretty poor. That's true both of the Hathi set and our database. Next, please. Quinn mentioned a couple of the gap analysis, just to add to that a little bit. So in addition to fewer than half of the titles that we have existing in the HathiTrust workset, there were some other sort of distributional factors related to this text workset that we're using for the text mining. Just that, yeah, it lacks recent authors. There's less diverse tribal representation than in our workset, and pretty much almost all of the materials are English language medium materials. There's not a whole lot of coverage of language materials in general, but particularly those that are not in English, which I think are all understandable limitations given the sort of mission and what Hathi collects and is about. Other things, most Native authors in North America that are represented in HathiTrust are writing in English. So that wasn't even, it wasn't one of our search parameters or anything like that. We weren't purposefully filtering that out, but it just happens to be the case that for North America and Canada, most of the works are in English, which again, I think is understandable, but I was a little disappointed at how few works in other languages there were. For example, we have some collection of Tohono O'odham poetry by Ophelia Zepeda, a couple things like that in the data set, but not very much. And then as far as sort of trying to get good tribal coverage, we both our data set and the Hathi dataset represent 13% or fewer of federally recognized tribes. So there's a lot of tribes out there that either, you're kind of smaller and their members aren't publishing, or, they haven't gotten included for one reason or the other in the data set. Like Quinn said, we are very purposefully trying to improve our representation and continue to build particularly newer works into the data set to try and address some of that. But 13% is pretty low. Next slide, please. Okay, so a little bit about the keyword and context. So just taking the sort of the big picture view here for a second, most of the terms we were interested in searching didn't show up until the 1960s, which I realize this graph is a total mess, but you can sort of see that the number of lines starting on the right-hand side are much denser than the bunch on the left-hand side. And you can see where there's kind of nodes where the number of volumes that we have for certain years were very low, like for the 40s and 50s and for the 1800s. So that's why it looks kind of odd and clustery like that, because again, we're talking percentages here. So I think that also is sort of a reflection of how new really Native American studies is, and how kind of newish the discourse is when we think about what characterizes topics and things of interest for this textual community. Next, please. So we searched lots of categories, and actually there was more sort of overarching categories than we shared, but just to pull out a few things that I think are sort of general interest. I was sort of surprised that the mentions of people, both sort of historical people and more recent people, was very low across both data sets, the comparative non-native set and the native set. Things that were referenced more frequently were AIM, like the American Indian movement, Red Power movement, and contemporary Native people were mentioned more in the native data set than in the non-native data set. So again, just a caution that the Y scale here is way, way off, so that you can tell the difference between where the lines are, but that orange line on the left is the American Indian movement. So that's not statistically significant difference from the contemporary or from the non-native set, but it is mentioned more in the native set than the non-native set. Next one. We also had a lot of events in there, both sort of battles, massacres, major events, removal, boarding schools, things like that. And for the most part, they sort of tracked between the comparative data set and the native data set in terms of frequency, but some things, like you can see Trail of Tears here, was mentioned more in the native data set than the non-native data set, even though it's not statistically significant. It was interesting to me that of all of the conflicts, Wounded Knee ended up being the most mentioned. We were also interested, there's a sort of a tension, where a lot of these things that get called battles were really massacres, right? And see if the textual references either between the two corpora reflected that, where perhaps like the native corpus would refer to them more as massacres and the non-native corpus would refer to them more as battles. We didn't really see that, actually. Battle was more frequent than massacre in both corpora. We're also interested to see how some of the terms from sort of the academic discussions and that we see in Native American studies had sort of percolated into the larger topic awareness, so to speak, into the larger lit community. And it seems that by and large that has not been the case. So things like survivance and sovereignty even had a surprisingly low frequency. Relationality, reciprocity, things like that, all very minimal mentions in both corpora. Community is that green line that you see in both of those. So talking about community in some way or another is popular sort of across the board. And we'll look more into the context to see if the types of uses are the same. Other just interesting things, you talk about, how do we refer to Native Americans and how do people, prefer to do that? By and far across all decades, Indian is still the most widely used term, including in more contemporary literature since the 2000s. That's sort of now closely followed by Native, which is that orange line there. None of the differences here are statistically significant, except for Aboriginal, for some reason, is used more in the non-native corpus, just something we'll look into more in the context. Indigenous, surprisingly, has a surprisingly low frequency, or at least I was surprised. So we also, the topic modeling we'll talk about in a second, but just in terms of the types of words that we use to describe topics that we associate with native works. Some things like land, obviously, is huge. Land, water rights, different types of spirituality. These sorts of things, we did the native corpus first and we saw these were really high and we're like, yes, this makes sense. That's what we expect. And then we looked at the non-native corpus and actually those are the top topics too in the non-native corpus, which is really interesting. So we're looking into the context there again to see if the frequency is representative of the way that those are talked about or not just, sort of the numbers. Okay, I will turn it over to Raymond.
Yeah, thank you, Quinn, and thank you, Raina, for your great work on this. Nothing represents in a certain way how we're in the kind of early stages of analysis than the topic modeling output that we have here. So I think we've looked at it and tried to kind of find out some themes in the various bodies of work that we're looking at. Quinn, if you could move to the next one, where we might make a little bit more sense of this. So when we're looking at the native work set, and by that we mean mostly authors who have identified themselves as Native American in their own writing and also elsewhere. And we can get into kind of how we define this and have created this list in the question period. But we get a sense of the top 20 topics that come about, and we have regions in there. Some of them we can make of, the West, the Southwest. There's linguistic kind of discussions. Culture and tradition was one of the topics that came out, as well as government and tribal relations. There are some, of course, that we would have a bit of surprise that they're in there, such as plane crashes or daily life. So at this point, we're kind of not really able to do, I think, a lot with it just individually, but comparatively, it kind of, when looking at the non-native work set, and Quinn, if you can forward the slide. There seems to be slightly different topics that come up. So anthropology was one that was quite a bit different, and then the top being government and tribal relations. There were similar: war, treaty making, military, kind of conquest, archaeological. So these kind of maybe hearken to an understanding of Native peoples as, let's just use the term primordial or something ancient, and that kind of, rather than maybe things like daily life and tradition. So we haven't thought too much about this yet, but we're starting to ask questions to go back to the data set through looking at these topics. So Quinn, if we can forward to the next one. So some of the results kind of show us that there is a lot of overlap. And then we have colonial government and tribal relations, some linguistic interest, industry, economic development, native arts, subsistence, kinship, ceremony. And, it would, in a certain sense, of someone who's going to work on the analysis in terms of the writing, it would be a lot easier if we saw a great deal of difference. So for instance, if, as Raina had mentioned, that around terms that deal with nature, the most natural thing would be to versus non-native authors, but that didn't really kind of come up. So what is it that we're able to kind of do with that? And there's a limitation of perhaps what the field would be interested in how we kind of think about packaging that or what that means. So Quinn, if we can go to the next slide. So we can also think about there were some differences as well. As I had mentioned, the archaeological history, militarism is not in the authors that identify as Native American. So there's more culture and tradition in that set, and there's a close association with culture, medicine, community, government. I think we probably need to do some more analysis to think about maybe words around individualism versus obligation and collectivism. There's gambling, casinos, health, boarding schools. You could imagine these topics might make a lot of sense for the non-native set. So we're thinking about what this kind of can tell us and how this fits within the literature of Native American studies. Okay, Quinn, if you could take it to the next slide.
Talk about the word embedding. Thanks, Raina and Raymond, for your wonderful presentation and interpretation of the term frequency analysis and talk models. So for the word embedding, similarly, we need to read more into the result, but so far we are able to train the word embedding models on both the native workset and the comparative workset. We have applied phrase detection before we train the word embedding models, so we are able to query the most similar terms to a given term based on their contextual similarity, meaning the terms occur in similar contexts are considered similar. And we have set up a Google Colab environment to run the similarity inquiries live. Now I would like to show you some demos of what do that look like. Can you all see my Google Colab screen now? Okay, good. So on the left side, this is the word embedding result from the native workset, and on the right side are the result from the comparative workset. The two models are separately trained on two different worksets, so that when I give a query to the model, such as the current query I'm putting there is Sitting Bull, which is a very famous native people name. And then we can see what does the model think the terms that are similar to the terms in the query based on their contextual similarity. So you can see in the native workset, the top similar term to Sitting Bull are crazy horse, red cloud, spotted tail, Captain Jack. This list of terms, and actually you can see from the comparative data set, there are some similarities. Crazy horse, which means crazy horse must occur in similar contexts as Sitting Bull, and red cloud, spotted tail, Sitting Bulls, Tecumseh, black elk. And with that, we can give any terms that are of interest to both models. We can easily configure to change the terms that is in query from the both side. We can run the result live. You can see for the Trail of Tears, the left side is the result that is coming from the native workset. So the native workset, the top similar terms are Sand Creek, Natural Historical Trail, Forced Removal, Have Wept, the Soto Expedition, Death March, Burning Land Bridge. These are the terms that are considered by the model that are similar to Trail of Tears. And on the right side, there's some interesting terms. I don't know if that's come from their some of their page number or what. But there is Wounded Knee Massacre and Black Hawk War, Cherokee, DeSoto, Terrible Audio, Choctaw Indians. So these are the top terms. Cherokee Removal are the top terms that are considered similar to Trail of Tears. So our plan is if we can just run their terms that are of interest to native studies to see what the word embedding model consider are terms that's contextually similar to the term of interest, because this can reveal some ways of writing of the authors. These top similar terms may occur in similar contexts as the term of interest, right? So this can somewhat tell if the context of the terms are similar or different in the two different data sets. All right, let me get back to the presentation. So our plan is to compare the contextual similarity terms to understand the writing style of the native authors and the non-native authors. Okay, so with all that, I'm really glad you say this is actually our first time to publicly share our findings, although it's very initial, and we realize there's lots of work to do. We are so glad to have this opportunity to collect this data and work on this project. So for what's next, we realize we need to do more work to read into the results. We collected the keyword in context. We haven't really got into context quite yet, so far. We compared the term frequency, as Raina said. The next stage is to understand the context in which the term occurs and interpret the result. And we are also in the process of adding more works and more authors to our database, including the newer ones, and to increase the representation of the data set. And we have plans to look into the native language, as we have a special language specialist. So I want to make good use of her expertise to understand the use of the native language in English medium, native author works and contexts. And we have also planned to look at the topics, terms, and references from the journal, the prominent journal we mentioned, the American Indian Culture Research Journal, which is actually covered in HathiTrust. We have obtained their full text already. We have the plan to look more into that. Once we have the database set into certain stage, we would like to make our native authors database available and share findings with the communities of interest. And with that, I really want to express our gratitude for whoever present today and to listen to our talk. And we're happy to take any questions from the audience.
Thank you very much, Kuhn and Raina and Raymond, for that wonderful presentation. So as they say, we have a couple minutes still for questions. A few have come in. So I think the first couple of questions are about how you were able to identify, or how you identified authors for your to include in the different groups. How were you able to identify Native American authors? So is there a known collection? And then similarly, how were you able to decide on who you wanted to include in the contrasting group?
Well, I can take a shot, Raina and Raymond. If you guys want to add on it, feel free. So it was actually a pretty interesting task to identify the Native American author works at the first place, because we don't want to be the judge, say who is a Native American, who is not a Native American. You don't have their tribal enrollment or not, right? So what we did is trying to use the publicly available information, such as something published on the Internet Public Library, to list the authors, or some evidence that is publicly available, self-identifying the authors as a native. And they mention some of their biography or what, we can use those as evidence for their native membership. Raymond and Raina, you have something to?
Certainly, Quinn. Thanks for taking that one. And we'd also had in a separate project I've been working on a list of authors who've published in Native American Studies journals for the last 30 years in 2 journals. And what we did was look for and code for membership in a tribe, or someone described themselves as indigenous. So we had this other list as well that we could then apply. Now, obviously, we're going to miss folks in that who are not self-identified and not publishing in Native American Studies journals, or Native peoples that are not publishing in Native Studies. Raina, you want to jump in on that one as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have some of that metadata as part of the Native American Languages collection for the materials that came from our database, but that was a minority of things. Yeah, we basically take the publicly available information and then attempt to sort of verify to the best of our ability. Given the sticky issues around tribal identity, that's sort of the best that we can do.
Thank you for that answer. I think there's a lot of interest around that because libraries are very interested in ways to diversify their own collections and aren't really sure about how to necessarily go about that in the proper way. Another follow-up question, or question to that would be, so what's in the term frequency section, I believe that you had, Raina, what's the scale on the y-axis, the 0 to 1 terms?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's it was important for us to try and, as Quinn was describing, normalize a little bit. So for example, you could have a biography of Custer in there that's gonna say Custer like hundreds, maybe thousands of times, and that's not really representative. So what we did was take the percentage of works that mentioned a particular term of the total number of works for that decade. So that's why it's out of 1 would be the maximum, and then I scaled if the lines were all going to be too scrunched at the bottom. So that's all that is.
Great, thank you. Well, I think we're at time for this, so I'm going to go ahead. Well, first, I'm going to thank you all again. That was a wonderful presentation, and thank you everyone for attending. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording right now.